If you are an American citizen who does not want to ashcan the American system of government, who doesn't want a strongman authoritarian system where the whole government is one guy and everything else just exists to serve him, if that is not the kind of country that you want, then yesterday's election means you have more to do for your country than you have ever done before. Because now is when the rubber really hits the road, right? We don't just flip a switch and the American system of government is gone. Democracy is gone. It doesn't work like that. I mean, not to be boring here for a second, but just getting very real. We now are just another one in the list of countries that has decided to, hey, what the heck? Let's try the strongman thing. Let's let democracy go. Let's put in an all-powerful guy instead, see how it goes. There are many more countries in the world governed by that kind of a system than there are governed by ours. We are the only 248-year-old multiracial, pluralistic democracy in the world. And shall we keep it? A lot of our fellow Americans say we shouldn't. Now we know. Now we know for sure. But a lot of Americans, tens of millions of Americans, say we should keep that system. Which means time to fight for it. And yes, Americans did fight for it by working on this election, by trying to get the candidate elected who was both the Democrat and the small d Democrat. She didn't win. The strongman candidate won instead. But now history doesn't end. Time doesn't stop. Now we have the benefit of knowing, how this has gone in every other country that has been through a democracy to authoritarian transition. And sadly, there are a lot of them. We have the benefit of seeing what's happened in those other countries, though. And what we know is that the more ground the authoritarian takes, the harder it is to ever get that ground back. And so the first order of business is to stop them from taking any uncontested ground right from the outset when it comes to what our system of government is and what our democracy is. Right? We know from other countries' experiences that quickly, now, in the next few weeks, if not the next few days, they are going to start pushing to see how far the country is going to let them go without pushback, without protest. And part of this is because it's just psychologically advantageous for them to do this now, right? They're counting on the half the country that voted against them, the half the country that doesn't want to give up our system of government. They're counting on all those tens of millions of Americans to be despondent, to feel powerless, to check out, which, of course, would mean letting them do what they want, letting them run the table. What they really don't want is for the half the country that voted against them, the half the country that wants to keep our democracy. What they really don't want is for those tens of millions of Americans to wake up tomorrow feeling scrappy as hell, feeling, regretful about the election outcome, but also, frankly, freed up from having to spend all of our time working on the election. So now we can work full time on being fricking pirates, on being a thorn in the side to anyone who now intends to try to turn this country into some tin pot tyranny. What they want least of all is to realize that half the country went to bed sad tonight, but then woke up tomorrow fired up with a new sense of purpose, knowing that apparently this is what we're on this earth to do as American citizens in this generation. Because history did not just end. Time did not just stop. We just got marching orders from the universe and the Electoral College that as of today, American citizens who do want to hold on to democracy, we know exactly what we're going to be spending the next days and weeks and likely years of our life working on. And the strategic first moves come into focus quickly when you think about what other countries have shown us about how hard it is to regain democratic ground once an authoritarian leader has taken that ground. And the work has to be done now. The work that has to be done now, it has to happen in sort of every aspect, every corner of our society. The U.S. military needs to give the American people binding assurances that they will not deploy U.S. military force against the civilian population in this country. They can give those assurances, and now they should. The free press needs to give the people of this country assurances that they will not become state TV, that they will stand and fight together. They will put aside rivalries and petty professional differences. They will stand and fight together as the free press, as the Fourth Estate, as an institution that is a pillar of our democracy, as these guys on the other side inevitably start picking off individual journalists, individual publishers, individual news organizations to try ultimately to turn us all into some American accented version of RT. If the Democratic Party takes the House, expect Article 1 of the Constitution to come under attack. By which I mean expect efforts to hollow out the power of Congress, to make Congress a just-for-show institution, right? There's a reason actions of the Russian Duma never make news, right? Expect efforts to attack Article 1, to make it a just-for-show institution that has had its real powers taken over by the executive, by the dear leader. We are going to need a plan and some steel spine inserts among elected officials in Washington to head that off. We're going to need the whole country to recognize that risk in advance, to call it what it is when they try it, and to actively resist it. Depending on whether the courts can provide a check on this administration, expect Article 3 of the Constitution to come under attack as well. It is already a fetish and a laugh line on the right to brag about how court orders really mean nothing and physical force and violence is what ultimately really decides what's allowed. Well, we have to decide if that laugh line from them is going to become our reality or whether we're going to resist that. We need a plan and some steel spine inserts among members of the judiciary to head that off. We're going to need the whole country to recognize that risk in advance. We're going to need every lawyer in the country to recognize it as their calling to fight it. We're going to need to call it what it is when it inevitably happens, and we're going to have to actively resist it. And then there's civil society. Is there a more boring term in the world that doesn't include the word committee or budget? No, there isn't. Civil society, though, is kind of where the rest of us are at, right? Civil society is one of the things that I think of as soft food for authoritarians. They often don't even have to bite that hard to crush it. All the organizations, membership groups, advocacy groups, professional associations, every voluntary group of every kind in the country, everything in organized American life and culture that is not business and not the government either, that is civil society. And authoritarians need to crush that because it's not about them. Strongmen leaders have a tendency to become not just leaders of the government, not just dictators, but totalitarians, because they can't have anything going on in the country that isn't about them or for them. And a strong civil society, therefore, must be crushed, right? If you have a strong civil society, that gives people breathing room to think for themselves, to organize in their own interests, to speak with the power of more than just one person. We need assurances from civil society leaders today that they're not going anywhere and that they will fight for our democracy, too. And frankly, it's not just the leaders. We all need to participate in more civil society things than we have before to make sure that we are taking up space that otherwise they're going to try to take for the government and the dear leader. And what I mean by this, in short, is join something. Doesn't really matter what it is. But you want right now to be connected to other Americans and not isolated on your own. So deep breaths. Hydrate. Maybe time to get back in shape. Do you have any burned bridges in your past? Unburn them. Reconnect with people, whether it's your family or the people on your block or in your town, your old friends from school, that book club, that indivisible group, maybe. Reconnect or connect for the first time. Join something. Join something. If this election was about one candidate who stood for the American form of government and another who stood for getting rid of that because America's a garbage can and I alone can fix it, just give me all the power and I'll do it all. If that was the choice in this election, then the aftermath of the American people making the choice they did in this election is not just the end, right? It's not just, oh, it's over. It means we're now entering into a contest. It will now be an effort on his side to put that into practice, right? To put strongman authoritarian government into practice. And it will be an effort on the other side, an ongoing, continuing, and now newly urgent effort on the other side to let him know that it's not going to be easy. These next few days and weeks, if they really are going to try to dismantle the American form of government, including firing all federal employees, right, including rounding up their enemies, including opening internment camps to hold millions of people, threatening military force against their perceived enemies, if they really are going to try to undermine the American system of government, which is what they've made this campaign about, then in the next days and weeks, they are going to be testing to see what they can get away with without pushback. They are going to do the things they can do easily, and they will have to put off the things that turn out to be hard. So what's going to be hard for them? That's where the American people come in. We do not only work for our country and for our democracy in elections. We work for our country and for our democracy against anyone, anywhere, anytime who seeks to do it harm. And so there's a lot to do. Time doesn't stop. History doesn't stop. We have stuff to do. Millions of Americans woke up today to the realization that although you worked as hard as you could to try to bring about the election outcome you wanted, you did not get the election outcome you wanted. And so now what that means is that there is a whole new raft of stuff to do. Hope you are feeling scrappy. Hope you are tapping into your inner pirate energy. Because it is one thing to be a defender of the realm. It is another thing to be in opposition. And opposition can be a lot of things. It can be dangerous. It can also be fun. It would have been nice to win the election. Didn't. Okay. Time to save the country.
This was a movement like nobody's ever seen before. And frankly, this was, I believe, the greatest political movement of all time. There's never been anything like this in this country, and maybe beyond. And now it's going to reach a new level of importance because we're going to help our country heal. We're going to help our country heal. We have a country that needs help, and it needs help very badly. We're going to fix our borders. We're going to fix everything about our country. And we made history for a reason tonight, and the reason is going to be just that. We overcame obstacles that nobody thought possible, and it is now clear that we've achieved the most incredible political thing. Look what happened. Is this crazy? But it's a political victory that our country has never seen before, nothing like this. I want to thank the American people for the extraordinary honor of being elected your 47th president and your 45th president. It's time to put the divisions of the past 4 years behind us. It's time to unite. And we're going to try, we have to try, and it's going to happen. Success will bring us together. I've seen that. I saw that in the first term when we became more and more successful. People started coming together. Success is going to bring us together, and we are going to start by all putting America first. We have to put our country first for at least a period of time. We have to fix it. Because together we can truly make America great again for all Americans. So I want to just tell you what a great honor this is. I want to thank you. I will not let you down. America's future will be bigger, better, bolder, richer, safer, and stronger than it has ever been before. God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you very much.
This morning, Donald Trump has secured a second presidential term. Moments ago, NBC News projected he won the state of Wisconsin, giving him the electoral votes needed for victory. He's also leading the popular vote as well. It is the third battleground state he flipped. after winning Georgia and Pennsylvania. The races in Arizona, Michigan, and Nevada are still too close to call. Vice President Kamala Harris has not yet made a statement about the race. The crowd at her Howard University watch party was asked to go home shortly before 1 a.m. Cedric Richmond, who is a co-chair of the Harris-Walz campaign, told attendees the vice president would not speak until later today. A lot to go through, a lot of questions this morning. Joe, we'll start with your take.
Well, I mean, so much to go through, so many questions. I came onto the set and Willie said, hey, by the way, because we were talking about the historic nature of this sweep.
Yeah.
And Willie said, do you know, he only lost Illinois by 4 points.
4 points,
New Jersey by 5. I mean, you talk about we had talked about a red wave 2 years ago that never materialized. This is I've got to say, this is the biggest red wave I've seen since Ronald Reagan's 49 state victory in 1984. It seems every Republican across the country improved.
Donald Trump is on track to sweep the 7 battleground states. We still have 3 outstanding. We'll see how those go. But he did better almost everywhere. In every county where the hope from the Harris campaign was that she would make up ground on Joe Biden's suburbs, Donald Trump actually did better. We'll break down some of these numbers, but the gender gap was not nearly as wide as the Harris campaign needed to be, and Latino men came out in force for Donald Trump.
Boy, what a huge difference that made. And, you know, that was really just part of the stunning outcome. I mean, America, first of all, is far more to the right than any time in our lifetimes, even going back to the Reagan years. And Donald Trump won in dominating fashion. But he did that along with other Republican candidates in the Senate races and the House races. They're likely to dominate all branches of government for the next several years. And Donald Trump not only broke out through that sort of hard ceiling of 47-48%. Think about this. He became only the second Republican to win a majority of the popular vote since 1988. In 36 years. And he did so after a week of polls, most notably Ann Seltzer's revered Des Moines Register poll showed Harris making remarkable inroads among the type of voters who would swing the margin for Harris in the blue wall states. The opposite actually ended up being true. Donald Trump won in a rout across Big Ten country, taking Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin without a serious fight. And now, with expectations rising in the Harris camp in the final days of the campaign in a historic ground game, when you look at the depth of it and the reach of it, this race still ended up being over before it began. And Jonathan Lemire, I mean, it is, again, the scope and scale of this victory is sweeping. And we can focus, by the way, we can focus on Donald Trump if we would like. But this goes so far beyond Donald Trump. Make no mistake, his victory, again, historic. But you look at Republicans across the nation. You look at how handily they're winning states. As Willie said, you look at Illinois, a 4-point margin. Illinois, a 5-point margin in New Jersey. This is a Democratic Party that has been just wiped out this morning.
Yeah, Republicans steamrolled. They have captured the Senate. The House still up for grabs, but those close to Speaker Johnson think the Republicans are on track to have that as well, potentially handing Donald Trump a unified Republican Washington, D.C. when he takes office. It was stunning. We thought this election could take days to be counted. It was over late last night, early this morning now with the official call. You mentioned the Iowa poll that so many Democrats had hung so much hope on in recent days that had Harris up 3 points. Right now, the margin for Trump in Iowa is about 14 or 15 points. This is a 16 or 17 point miss.
Unbelievable.
A 16 or 17 point miss there. There was not this surge of voters breaking late to Harris as it turned. And for Donald Trump, it must be said, this is a president. He was impeached twice. He botched the handling of the pandemic. He faced 4 criminal cases. He inspired January 6th, and he won anyway. And now he will return to office with few guardrails internally, encouragement from Moscow and other foreign adversaries, and a Supreme Court that has said that his power is largely unchecked.
Well, I've got to say, historians will look back at those trials over the past summer, John Heilemann, where he was sitting in there, and it certainly fed into his victimhood. And that will be seen. Those trials where he's sitting in court all day will be seen as an as-kind contribution for Donald Trump, because there is no doubt those trials this summer were a defining moment in this campaign.
And defining not in the way that obviously a lot of opponents of Donald Trump hope they would be. There will still be, I think historians will be grappling with a lot of questions going forward, including the question of how someone who is a convicted, first ever convicted criminal convictions against a former president could win in this fashion. And I think, we've all sat here and talked about the extraordinarily, for a lot of people, extraordinarily offensive performance of Donald Trump in these last 2 weeks. The things that he did and said seemed like he was, we literally just sitting here the last few days, kind of like, how can this man, the way he's performing in the closing days of this campaign, how can this guy get elected? He seems like he doesn't want to get elected. The things performing, miming oral sex on a microphone stand, and all the rest of it. The enemy within, the various things that provoked John Kelly to come out and say the things he said. All of that stuff, in the end, didn't matter. And I think one of the things that didn't matter enough to keep him from performing better in this election than he has performed in any of the prior ones. That will be a question for psychologists, sociologists, historians, political scientists for a long time. Right. Because I think for a lot of people in the country, it is unthinkable that Donald Trump, this could be the one that he could improve his performance from the past. But he did. And I think the other question we now are going to be grappling with, that's quite clear, is we have had consistent polling that has had this race effectively a tie. I'm looking here at the polling, the end polling averages, where Donald Trump in a lot of these states was at 47, 48, consistent with the notion that he had this ceiling. That he had never been above 47% before. Right. It looks like there's going to be in these battleground states about a 3-point polling miss in aggregate again, as there was a 4-point polling miss in aggregate in 2020, and there was a 3.5-point polling miss in 2016. The polling industry right now, public and private, has now in 3 successive elections missed Donald Trump's support in America by substantial numbers. And I will say, finally, the thing that you heard from people in the Harris campaign in the battleground states, particularly in those blue wall states, was if the numbers are right, meaning the numbers we were seeing in public and their own numbers. If those numbers were right, it's really a tie, they would say. Yep. We think our ground game will help us win. It turned out those numbers were in fact wrong. And there were people who said all along, hey, we could be looking at another 2020 and 2016 in which Trump's support is understated. And if that's the case, he could win all of these states by 2 or 3 points. And that is in fact what's happening.
This was the third
What's
time.
happened?
This was
3 times in a row.
This was the third time in a row, as you said, that Donald Trump's support was understated, especially in the upper Midwest states. Right. They just not working. But Mika, again, you go through it, you look at the final weeks of the campaign. It was not only the public polling, which most campaigns dismiss, but it was actually the polling inside the Harris camp. Right. They the last week were growing more confident because the numbers that they were seeing. The only people who had polls that ended up being right from the beginning were the Trump people. Remember, we kept saying they just had this solid confidence. They were overconfident. Their numbers weren't matching the private numbers of Harris. They weren't matching the public numbers. They had the right numbers all along because they were saying we're getting more votes from Hispanic men. We're getting more votes from black men. We are going to do better. And they were never internally, they were never worried. I think until the Ann Seltzer poll came out, and then they said, could we be that wrong? And it ended up, they were not that wrong. Yeah.
How did Trump increase his support this much? He made inroads in groups that have been Democratic voters, going from about 32% of the Latino vote to 45%. That's a 13-point jump. It's a major shift reflected across the country. It was even higher in some key states where Trump campaigned. He won 50% of the Latino vote in North Carolina, 58% of it in Michigan. It's the first presidential race since abortion bans became law, but Donald Trump's coalition actually improved a bit among women, going up 3, even as he ran famously against this woman candidate. Trump is now the oldest candidate to win the White House, yet he intensely and repeatedly targeted young men and newer, younger mediums like digital media and podcasts. And he cut into the typical youth support that Democrats enjoy, improving about 6 points with voters under 30. And finally, a look at how Trump did this requires something. And it requires that we look at the entire map beyond the swing states, because what you see here in total, and obviously it's all a lot of little indicators, but when you see it in total, much of the country moved towards the GOP, including in states like New York and New Jersey. You're looking at those arrows that show counties going towards Republicans, and you'll notice very little blue in the other direction. That's how Trump's winning coalition came together. Now, why? Why did he win those and other groups over? The answer matters for understanding reality, as reality really is. And in politics, the answers that people embrace matter a lot because they shape power and how others respond for even years to come. If everyone thinks a candidate won because his closing message denigrated Puerto Rico or because he acted bizarre on stage, then other candidates, notice the comparison here, will mimic that as a winning strategy, just as Trump's red MAGA style is echoed right down to the red tie by his political wannabes. So politicians often claim any victory is a mandate for their entire agenda. Then the actual governing begins, and some things are harder to enact than others. So why did Trump win this election? I just told you why the answers to that matter, but why did he win based on what voters did and said? Many voters said their top issue was the economy. It came second only to democracy, which, of course, was Harris's closing message, and it handily beat abortion, as you see here in the new numbers. Abortion was a vital issue for many, but it did not eclipse high prices and economic disruptions. And in a race that ran about 50 to 47, so pretty divided, take a look at this. 68% of voters came together on the view that this economy is poor or not so good. When you take the political question that Republicans first used against a one-term Democrat, you might remember, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Trump asked that a lot. 46% say worse off, only 24% say better, 30% about the same. That echoes numbers we've reported on before the election about how most Americans think we are on the wrong track. And while Biden and Democrats did try to talk people out of that view, the reality they felt they were living, and pitch data on inflation fading a bit, which it was, one of the most striking findings in the electorate Tuesday is not about Biden or Trump's policies. It's not some embrace of everything Trump ever said or pitched. It's an electorate reeling from the hardship of high prices and inflation to a degree that many elites may not have experienced personally or always treated as a top issue. In just the last year, so not going all the way back to COVID or 2 years ago, in the last year alone, a majority said inflation caused them hardship, 22% saying severe. If you put that together in the numbers, as we discussed in our breaking election coverage on Tuesday night, 75% of voters feel that recent hardship from inflation. And Trump won those voters. He won those who said they face severe hardship by 50 points. This trend goes well beyond the United States or Donald Trump. Voters have been booting incumbent politicians over exactly this issue, economic pain after COVID, around the world. This went on in what you could call inflation elections in democracies ranging from UK to Poland to Argentina to India to South Korea to South Africa. This has been a thing that has been well known in many places that have no Trump. So if you listen to the voters, that's the largest overriding reason. If you listen to past elections, it's an iron law of politics that incumbents are most likely to lose when the economy is bad. Now, there's a reason the most famous political saying in American politics still remains, it's the economy's stupid, from our friend James Carville. Those trends suggest some reasons why voters who've long disliked Trump could pick him over the incumbent party's vice president. There are people across ideologies who have come together on backing the tenets of just trying to maintain in the United States the nonpartisan goal of the type of society that Trump has defiantly opposed: democracy, human rights, and some basic respect for fellow citizens. Not having a leader who talks in a way that would get you fired from your job or booted from a bar or worse. Well, one part of that process is what now? Trump's Democratic opponents may have to assess their own party's shortcomings. I'm not talking about some immediate surrender to Donald Trump's worst appeals or mimicking him, but Democrats could have the same hard, factual conversations they so often demanded Republicans have about their side, especially in the last 8 years. And even with the big trends just mentioned, it is relevant when you look at the results and the reaction in the country that the Democratic Party basically spent a year shouting down legitimate questions about President Biden, held some primaries, picked the results there, the voters picked Biden, and then the party pushed him out in a rushed top-down process.
Relative to what we can do with more Border Patrol and more asylum officers.
It was a slow start. There's no question about that. But I thought it was a strong finish.
Kind of a DEFCON 1 moment.
We have breaking news here. President Biden has announced he will stand down from the race.
That process handed Kamala Harris the shortest runway ever for a new candidate against the headwinds I just mentioned. It skipped the voting process that all prior candidates tend to go through. Democrats may find some value in exploring how they're losing ground with working people, young people, and some minorities. And even beyond the incumbent trends I mentioned, for those surprised that there is this MAGA plan and argument out there, surprised by how it sounds and what they're pitching and how it evolved and where it had appeal, well, that may come from ignoring people and information that was available. It's not a surprise to viewers of this program. As you can see here, we have been hearing from Trump's top aides, from Bannon to Navarro to Miller. We've pressed and fact-checked them according to our journalistic mission, but we've also, through that process, listened and followed their evolutions. That would be part of any informed activity in being alive and being a citizen engaging in politics. Bowing out on that, ignoring what's happening, puts you in a bubble. And bubbles are not only artificial, I can tell you bubbles usually pop. Now, whether Democrats look in the mirror or people listen more, that's really the politics, probably for the politicians. That's not the whole part of this section, though, of my report for you tonight. What now for our civil society? These 8 years of Trumpism have brought us a more divided, vulgar, cynical, and dishonest discourse in public life because of him and his apparent resilience and success. The examples are well known. I'm not going to hash through them all right now, but he attacks elections and facts. He and his party attack voting rights, your very role in your democracy. And many may recoil from these election results or want to just ditch civic engagement. That's a choice. But that's exactly what they want. Remember, it's called voter suppression for a reason. Abandoning ship may save you, but it probably won't save the ship. History is also instructive here. In past times of unrest and talk of American fascists, remember, some of our counterculture leaders have talked about turning on, tuning in, and dropping out. And that is, of course, your choice. But maybe a better course is just taking a break, getting perspective, and locking back in. In or out of office, Donald Trump also attacks forces that have the power to possibly check him. So if you give up on voting, which obviously has that power, or you give up on the independent press, that's a pretty compliant response to someone trying to get you and the public to do just that. He has a playbook against journalists. We know across the world, politicians often try to abuse power against journalists, dissidents, artists with independence and with followings because they matter. And think about it. It's especially true when an opposition, meaning fact-checking, accountability, independent information, when it's rooted in facts or independence, it's especially powerful because it's different than the political opponents who can often be dismissed as simply competing for power of their own. We also have guardrails in terms of what now. Sometimes it's voters. Sometimes it's the law. I'm not sugarcoating history that we lived through. Donald Trump did exploit loopholes well known to many about our legal systems, that the rich and the powerful can evade laws that still bind others, that they get all kinds of special treatment, and then his Supreme Court also granted him a new set of powers he may now test. But that's only part of the story. He also was repeatedly blocked from abusing power, courts stopping his travel ban in its tracks, as you may remember. And when Trump did plunge into now proven convicted criminal plots, even though, yes, he was able to evade much for himself, his top aides were definitely held accountable, prosecuted, some imprisoned, as you see here, this very year. Trump's second-term hires could be more extreme. But remember, federal judges have life tenure. They can be a check. A president has no control over local and state courts or government in our federal system. And much of what I've said to you tonight is national in its nature, about the whole country, about the federal government. Many key tasks ahead are still at the local level. Your own school districts, your own libraries, your own local officials who are directly involved in your life that you might meet and spend time with regularly. That's not only a ripe area for civic engagement, could be more tangible and even less overwhelming for many people. So, maybe no one needs to do anything today, but even making a personal vow to at least reject that temptation, which is real, to drop out or prematurely surrender to the very apathy they want, that may be a start for you today. And as for what comes after that, I assure you, this is still a democracy, and we can still have a conversation and decide on what comes next together.
Welcome back to our second hour of our special election coverage. Everyone today, I think, is making sense, to the extent it's possible, of what happened last night. Fair to say that most of the people watching right now, all of the people, I think, up here on this panel, I think it was a very bad outcome for the country. I certainly do. But there's a question of why it happened and what comes next. And I do actually think it's really important to be as clear-eyed as possible about why it happened and what happened. Donald Trump won a majority of votes in the Electoral College, and for the first time in his 3 presidential runs, he appears poised to win the national popular vote. But if you look at why he won, I also think it's clear it was primarily the driver, a rejection of the status quo in a period where many voters feel alienated from their leaders and squeezed by high prices. The right track, wrong track numbers were 2-to-1, people saying the country's on the wrong track. And here's the thing that's really important. They feel that way across the Western world, where incumbent parties, left, right, and center, have met the exact same electoral fate post-COVID in an era of exploding inflation that no one had experienced in 30 years. This was an election defined by a rejection of a status quo that big majorities did not like, even people that voted for Kamala Harris. Now, the thing about this is Trump and Republicans have an interest, vested interest, in interpreting this as a mandate for all of their worst governing impulses. All the Stephen Miller-style Project 2025 dark fantasies of smashing the administrative state. But those ideas were never popular. Remember, we've been through this. They were polling at 6%. Trump tried to distance himself every chance he had from them because they polled so terribly. When you wrote down what they wanted to do, people didn't like it. That was not the source of this victory. You can see it all over America in last night's results. You can see what happened down ballot in North Carolina. Voters picked Trump by a slight margin at the same time they elected Democrats as governor and lieutenant governor, attorney general, school superintendent. They may have flipped enough legislative seats to take away the Republican supermajority and veto power. And you can see it in referenda around the country. And in 7 states, including the Trump states of Arizona, Missouri, and Montana, voters approved measures enshrining abortion rights. Voters in deep red Missouri and Alaska also approved raises in the minimum wage. They joined Nebraska in mandating paid sick leave to workers. Just to add to all that, New Jersey elected its first Asian American senator. Maryland elected its first black and female U.S. senator. So did Delaware, meaning the U.S. will have 2 black female senators for the very first time in its history. Delaware has given Congress its first openly trans member. What I want to say is that this is a nation that, because of last night, has suddenly signed on wholesale to the far-right agenda of MAGA and Trump and the Republican Party. But we know they are going to interpret this election as a mandate for precisely that, for full MAGAism. And we also know they have a plan. It really is a destructive plan to the American Constitution, to American democracy, most importantly to so many of our fellow Americans, mixed-status families, trans folks, women, working-class voters who are going to take it on the chin from tariffs and gutting labor law. And we also know Donald Trump is an aspiring authoritarian. I mean, the guy does not have a democratic bone in his body. He tried to overthrow the constitutional order with violence. We all saw it happen on national television. He celebrated it, talked about using political violence repeatedly in his campaigns. And because of all that, we know they're going to try to do things to subvert and alter the constitutional order. But the most important thing to those of us who are committed to stopping them is to remember their success is not foreordained in any way. They're going to try, and there are going to be a lot of people who try to stop them. And the outcome of that is as yet undetermined. And I'm not saying this from some place of airy hope. We've been covering Trump since 2015. We covered his first term. He tried to do lots of bad things and failed to do them because he is completely distractible and inconstant, because he's a vortex of chaos, because he cannot be stopped from doing stupid, self-destructive things all the time. None of that changed because he won an election. They're all the same people. He's the same guy. Are Republicans better prepared this time? Are they more loyal? Is the judiciary more in their favor? Yes, yes, and yes. But does that mean the outcome is foreordained? No. And the reason I say that is that public opinion, mass opinion, it's not a fixed thing. It's a real force, and it changes, and it flows, and it reacts to events. And even Donald Trump has backed down when he found himself on the wrong side of it. He has tried to move away from his most extreme anti-abortion position. He's tried to distance himself. He understands it's unpopular because there was mobilization against it. One of the most monstrous things he did in his first term, as documented in my colleague Jacob Soboroff's incredible documentary and book, Separated, was to essentially kidnap migrant children from their families. And as the press reported this, and as the courts reviewed it, it became clear this was both cruel and illegal. And while it was a federal judge that first blocked it, freezing it, the thing that ended child separation was a full rejection by the Democratic polity. Thanks to organizing and mobilization and protest, Americans across the spectrum rightly came to see it as monstrous, rejected it loudly. In the end, Trump signed the executive order ending the practice and then, classic, tried to take credit for getting rid of the heinous policy he had implemented. But in the end, they had to abandon it because it was so unpopular. That's just one example. There will likely be things he doesn't abandon, but in the face of that, it really is important not to concede in advance that politics don't matter. They do. Public opinion still matters. Politics didn't go away in America because 3 out of 100 people switched their presidential vote, which is, to be clear, what happened last night between 2020 and 2024. And politics depends on the work of organizing and mobilizing and persuading our fellow Americans. None of those tools have gone anywhere. In fact, all of them are even more important this time around. We have to pick them up, and we can't let anyone pry them from our hands.
Moments away from Vice President Kamala Harris's concession speech at Howard University. We'll bring you her remarks live as soon as she takes the stage. It is, of course, not the history she had hoped to make, but it will be an important message to the country and to everyone who fought alongside Vice President Kamala Harris in this unique and unprecedented and deeply abridged contest for president. In a race whose contours are still being unearthed, the people of this country spoke clearly and across every part of our nation about their deep dissatisfaction with the status quo. At this hour, Donald Trump has won 291 electoral votes and at least 71 million votes. An historic realignment potentially underway, an unprecedented rejection of an urgent bipartisan plea for decency, democracy, and access to women's health care. But as in 2016, when in the ashes of Hillary Clinton's cracked glass ceiling speech, the winning Biden coalition began to assemble itself, listen closely today to the stirrings of a new coalition, willing to listen to what voters had to say last night and prepare to fight for our democracy anew. Unlike 8 years ago, the threat Donald Trump poses to our institutions is a feature of this third campaign for the president and something people in every corner of civil society must rumble with today. New York Times puts it like this today, quote, America stands on the precipice of an authoritarian style of governance never seen in its 248-year history. After defeating Vice President Kamala Harris, who would have become the first female U.S. president, Trump will bring his own historic first into the White House, the only president convicted of dozens of crimes, accused of dozens more, and twice impeached. He will begin his second term bound by few political norms after a campaign in which he seemed to defy everyone. That is where we start today with some of our most favorite experts and friends. Here with me at the table, Joy Reid, host of The Readout right here on MSNBC, my wing woman into the hours last night. My other wing woman, former U.S. Senator, host of MSNBC's How to Win 2024 podcast, Claire McCaskill. My dear friend, chief political columnist, host of the podcast In Politic for Puck, MSNBC national affairs analyst, John Heilman's here. I'm going to apologize in advance for any interruptions because as soon as the vice president takes the stage, we'll go right to her. But your thoughts today?
So, I think one of the things that is the least helpful and that I've sort of started to hear the stirrings of out there are the dissection of the Kamala Harris campaign. Because I think it's clear from the results that when you look at the states that she won, we just saw Washington State where she won handily in the places and the constituencies that she won. People who were more secular, black women overwhelmingly, all but 20% of black men. Black men ticked up 1% from the last time that the same percentage voted for Donald Trump. That's not a change. The places where she made inroads, slight inroads among college-educated white women who went a little bit more her way. It's clear that given the fact that he won the popular vote, which is something that hasn't happened since your former boss in 2004, there's nothing that Kamala Harris could have done. There's no other sort of tweaks to her investment strategy of her billion-dollar campaign that was picture perfect in almost every way, but for a few things you could quibble with. The not allowing the uncommitted folks to speak at the convention will be looked at as maybe that could have helped her in Michigan had she embraced, Palestinian rights supporters more. But there is no tweak that she could have done that would have stopped her from being a black woman. And we know that this country has had a history of not supporting the freedom and rights of women, and even some women not supporting the freedom and rights of women broadly at the national level. And we know that this country has a deep history of anti-blackness. And when you look at the two constituencies that went hardest, that swung hardest for Trump, it was white men who we knew that's how they were going to vote. It was white women who still voted despite the deep and open disrespect shown to them by Donald Trump and especially by J.D. Vance. And it was Latino men who swung hard toward Donald Trump. And so I think what we've seen is we had essentially an Argentina election where you also had an election that was a hardcore surge of men, of men who were disgruntled with the liberalizing of society, and men who want a more authoritarian form of government, more control, and less social liberalism. There's nothing she could have done to change the way those men think. Going on Joe Rogan wouldn't have helped. None of the things none of it would have changed because she is the thing that they don't want, a black woman seeking power.
I totally agree, having been on winning campaigns and losing campaigns, that when you sit there at the forums, I know maybe that's another norm that Trump has killed, but you used to go with both sides and sit there, and the campaign that won would get all the accolades, and the campaign that lost would have to sort of confess to all their sins. And the truth is usually somewhere in between, right? There's often something structural afoot. And it seems, and again, I'm in the early stages of trying to learn myself from what was told, but it seems that there may be some insurmountable perception and reality of economic rage that was beyond people's personal household strain and stress and agony of the price of things that cost their family more, but also deep despair about kids that couldn't find work or kids that had moved back home or neighbors that were, it feels like it was widespread and potentially insurmountable.
Yeah, I think Donald Trump turned out that he knew our country better than we did. And I'm not sure I agree with a lot of what Joy said, but I think a lot of this is not the candidates, it's the country. And I think Donald Trump understood that what he could do, and I don't think his mistakes were mistakes. Mm-hmm. I think his mistakes were strategic and turned out to be right on the money, because I think our party, I grew up in a party where we were for the underdog. We were for the little guy. We are now the elite. We are no longer seen as the party for the little guy. He was seen as the party for the little guy. He was seen as the ultimate disruptor. And yes, the edges were very rough, but in everyone's own minds, they sanded them down to the point of acceptability. And as it turns out, there's a lot of craving in America for fear and anger. A lot of craving for fear and anger, driven by lies. But nonetheless, what this election result showed, especially if you look what's happened in the blue states, I mean, New Jersey turned out to be relatively close. New York, we lost huge ground. I mean, if this is not a gut check moment for the Democratic Party to realize that we need to get back to meat and potatoes and fighting like hell for the little guy. And by the way, he'll probably help us here because I have a feeling he's going to burn the house down. I hope he doesn't. I hope he doesn't do real damage that we can't recover from. But, and you know, I got to tell you, Joy, those uncommitted folks, you know, the first call he had this morning with Bibi Netanyahu, they're going to level Gaza.
Absolutely. And the West Bank. And not only level Gaza,
and this
but
is
they're going to take over the West Bank.
It's so frustrating to me that people were seeing this as something that wasn't an existential moment in our country. Can the Democratic Party recover? Yes. Is this the end of the world? No. But if anybody thinks this is about her doing something different in her ads or not doing this, they're not paying attention. There is something fundamentally changing in America about how the Democratic Party is perceived.
Can I just say very, very quickly, though, the co-founder of Uncommitted went on our air with our friend, our dear friend Andrea Mitchell, and supported her in the end. And people from the movement were absolutely supporting her. Wajahat Ali went way out on a limb. So Palestinian rights supporters in the end, the prominent ones, the woman who was in Georgia, the state representative who was not allowed to speak at the convention, voted for her and endorsed her. So it was not the Uncommitted movement writ large, but there was enough damage already done. And remember, you had Tiffany Trump's husband, who is Lebanese American, lobbying in Dearborn to try to pull Arab and Muslim American voters. But in the end, you definitely had a push toward her at the end. It just wasn't enough. So I wanted to throw that in.
Before we go to the event, John Helman, and if I interrupt you again, I apologize. You've got an ear to the ground to the folks who study data for a living, and I feel like you were getting some of the most sort of on edge gut checks in the hours before the election. In the conversation you and I had Monday afternoon,